Good morning. I'm Bob Hauser, Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's conference, A Life in Letters, a celebration of Dr. Barbara Oberg, which is hosted as a collaboration between the American Philosophical Society and the Omohundro Institute. Today's celebration honors the institutional and intellectual leadership of Dr. Barbara Oberg, who has played crucial roles in numerous organizations and initiatives throughout her career, especially in her capacity as general editor of the Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson papers. Her role as chair of the executive board of the Omohundro Institute, and her 12 years of leadership and service as chair of the Committee on Library at the American Philosophical Society. Barbara is also an APS member, elected in 1998. Throughout my 6 years as executive officer of the APS, I've thoroughly enjoyed Barbara's colleagueship and Perry's good company, actually both our good company. That was topped off, by the way, last night by a wonderful dinner at Fork, where we got to see the staff celebrating Ellen Yin's award as America's top restaurateur. Anyway, back to the point. To tell you more about Barbara and her accomplishments and some of the logistics for today's events, I invite Patrick Sparrow, Director of the George Washington Memorial Presidential Library at Mount Vernon and Librarian and Director Emeritus of the APS Library and Museum, to the podium.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And I guess for today, let's just say I'm still the librarian of the American Philosophical Society, soon to be director of another institution. I'm save a lot of my words and reflections for later on this evening before the keynote, when both Kathy and I have a moment to say a little bit more. But I just want to emphasize that the inspiration for today's event, what I think has brought us all together, is the career of Barbara Oberg, but not just the career, but who she's been as a person, as a mentor, as a leader of in the field, and also of scholarly organizations. And I have a longer list to read off later on tonight. But personally, she served as the chair of the Library and Museum Committee for 6 years at the APS, and her support and friendship and mentorship was hard for me to explain how important it was. So I just want to thank Barbara now, and there'll be more later. So our day really reflects Barbara's career as a scholar, as a documentary editor. We begin with a session on documentary editing, really looking not just to women in the revolution. Yeah, which is actually yeah. There you all are. Which is actually Barbara's most recent contribution, is a volume on women during the American Revolution published by UVA Press. And then we're moving to documentary editing, and not just looking at the past at documentary editing, but having sessions that are looking at the future of documentary editing in a digital world. And then we have sessions on Franklin and Jefferson, and Serena, I don't know those orders, but they're after lunch. So I also, as Bob said, I want to do some logistics, because I know many of you maybe have not been to the society before. But the restrooms, very important to know, because it's a little confusing. The women's restroom is straight out this door. The men's, however, is downstairs. And you can get there via the stairs outside of the doors behind you. Or also, if you need an elevator, there's an elevator that will take you down there as well. We also have a hashtag for this conference. It's hashtag BarbaraFest 2023. So you can. I encourage everybody to tweet so that other people can be participating. I also want to thank the We have over 50 people registered to Zoom into this conference online, so I want to welcome them and hope they can participate that way as well. We also are providing lunch, and that will be at the noon hour. We'll have boxed lunches for everybody here, and I believe that we're working on getting our museum open for just our guests. The current exhibition is Women in Science. The title is Pursuits and Persistence, 300 Years of Women in Science. It's a remarkable exhibition that highlights the contributions pioneering women scientists have made to the field, to the advancement of knowledge, but also the barriers that they faced throughout these many centuries. So with that, I want to turn things over to Kathy, who's going to say some more about Barbara and introduce the panel.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to celebrate Barbara Oberg's remarkable career. And that pleasure is heightened by the ability to stand here and look out and see so many distinguished scholars and colleagues and friends, all of you joining us today. As I suspect many of you know, and as Bob Hauser suggested, the Omohundro Institute has been a significant beneficiary of Barbara's energy, commitment, and intellect. She served on our executive board since 2010. She's been its chair since just this past spring when she became board member emerita. Before that, she served on our council and chaired that council. Throughout, she has been a terrific leader, prudent and incisive in equal measure. And as I say these things about Barbara, I see nodding heads and knowing smiles, and it's no wonder, because Barbara has been centrally involved in so many of the organizations that are devoted to shaping and extending our understanding of the American past. The APS, Colonial Williamsburg, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, the Society for Documentary Editors. Barbara's record of professional service would be remarkable under any circumstances, but it's all the more so given her scholarly contributions. She served famously as the editor of the Benjamin Franklin Papers and the Thomas Jefferson Papers. Her research has been supported by the International Center for Jefferson Studies, the Huntington Library, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the APS. And she has distinguished herself most recently as a scholar keenly invested in the history of the American Revolution, and especially women's roles within it. And we can see that in her 2019 edited volume, Women in the American Revolution, Gender, Politics, and the Domestic World. As Pat suggested, Barbara's illustrious career, spanning as it does archival research, documentary editing, and institutional leadership, inspired today's program, whose sessions have been curated to reflect her interests, her investments, and her accomplishments. And with that program very much in mind, I turn to Mary Beth Norton, the Mary Donlin Alger Professor Emerita of American History in the Department of History at Cornell University, who's going to chair our first session. No stranger to professional leadership herself, Mary Beth has worked tirelessly to make both the profession and our understanding of the past more inclusive and more equitable. Her work on gender, politics, and power is absolutely central to our understanding of colonial America and the Revolution. She's the author most recently of 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. But I suspect that two of Mary Beth's earlier books, Founding Mothers and Fathers, and especially Liberty's Daughters, will inform our first discussion. Mary Beth.
Are these on? Yes, they are. Okay. We only have an hour, and we have a lot to talk about. So what I want to do is to give very short introductions to the other people on this panel, and then move on to their comments. We've been asked by Adriana to speak for no more than 5 to 8 minutes each. I will not speak that long. I'm just going to give a little bit of a brief introductory remark. And so I've warned them I'm going to set the timer on my phone to go off after 7 minutes. So it may or may not go off, but they'll know what it means. I've warned them. Let's see. Let me start. We're not going to proceed in the order that's on the program. The first speaker will be Holly Mayer, who is, let me get this, because of course the program is in the order, the introduction, the bios are in the order that's here. I'm not going to give long introductions of these people who probably don't need these introductions. But she is Professor Emerita at Duquesne University and served as 2021-2022 Charles Bowl Ewing Chair in Military History at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, and Harold Johnson Chair at the Army War College in 2016-2017. She's worked primarily on women and the military history of the American Revolution. Our next speaker will be Lauren Duval, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Oklahoma and a historian of early North America and the Atlantic world. She's currently completing her first book, which is titled The Home Front: Revolutionary Households, Military Occupation, and the Making of American Independence, which is under advanced contract to the Omohundro Institute. She's published an article from this research. She's had the usual funding, and she is a contributor to 2 edited collections on the American Revolution, one of which Holly Mayer edited, Women Waging War in the American Revolution, and the forthcoming Cambridge History of the American Revolution. And I might add, she is my academic granddaughter. I'm extremely proud of that fact. I warned her I was going to say this. And then our third speaker will be Serena Zabin, who is professor of history and chair of the history department at Carleton College. She's also president of the Society of the History of the Early American Republic. She's the author of the prize-winning book, The Boston Massacre, A Family History, published in 2020, which was named an Amazon Editor's Choice for History in 2020, which I think is terrific. I assume it led to some great sales. Okay, so I just want to say, a couple of words of background, and then I'll turn it over to Holly and the other contributors. I think many people in the audience may know that Linda Kerber and I, in 1980, that's 43 years ago, both published books about women in the American Revolution. Before that, the only scholarship on women in the American Revolution was a book published by Mary Sumner Benson in 1938. And so there was a long gap. And then after Linda and I published our books, there was another gap. And we were both surprised because we thought that that our work would lead to other scholarship. But it was as though people thought we'd solved everything or we'd answered all questions. And we knew we hadn't. But what's happening now is a tremendous outpouring of new scholarship, including in the book that Barbara edited, the book that Holly edited, and so forth. And then, of course, the other works by people like Serena and Lauren. And so now what I want to do is turn it over to Holly to make some general comments first.
Thank you. It is great to be here with all of you this morning, back in Philadelphia. I always love wandering around here. So do you all hear me? It's all good? Excellent. First of all, there is never enough on women in the American Revolution. Okay? You can make careers on this particular topic. Indeed, there's not enough on women in many other events and eras and institutions. And yet, although we are indeed getting increasing notice, and indeed following with Barbara Oberg and Mary Beth Norton, Linda Kerber, it's out there, yet the increasing notice and the ongoing need continues to engender, to borrow Rosemary Zergari's term, backlash. And we are in an era of backlash. Or another word that came to mind for me to cover all of these decades is undertow. As all of these authors are working through these topics and certainly publishing, and we are discussing them, there is still a consistent undertow that we have to navigate or swim against or with until we can come to shore. It's not over yet. And there are various ways to look at this and to try to find the undertow and a way to swim past it. How's that for metaphors first thing in the morning? So how have we seen this over the past 5 decades, from when Barbara Oberg was in grad school, dealing with the scholarship available then, and as Mary Beth has just noted, very little was available then, to what's available now and to which she has contributed. Well, Barbara reflected on this a bit in the preface to Women in the American Revolution, Gender, Politics, and the Domestic World. As she noted, to quote Barbara, "Over the past several decades, the subject of the role and status of women during the War for Independence has attained its rightful place in the study of early American history." But what is that rightful place? Is a question we can ask. How central and how extensive is that place? The subject is certainly more deeply examined, and we could say diligently acknowledged, but how integral to the major narratives and analysis is it? What have been and continue to be the challenges? And I'm really into that question about integral. It is not just that we do indeed write articles and write monographs about what women were doing, their roles and their status and their places, their actions, but how is that integrated into the general narratives of the early American Republic and beyond? So that is part of the questions. If we do this and we look for progress and we look for undertow or backlash, are we getting beyond the one and done? I think in many ways we are. You can look at bookshelves, and there are more books on women's actions, certainly including in the American Revolution. But how about in those other monographs versus textbooks and popular histories about the Revolution in general? How are they integrated into those stories? Names, are they indeed named? How well do the few who are named serve the many? How well do they integrate the one, the models or the heroes, if you will, versus the groups and the group actions in this? How indeed do we make those group actions memorable or as influential in the past, in the present? And one of the reasons I bring that up is I was looking at it, and I'm going to bring up Woody Holton's book, right? The Hidden History, as he was talking about this. First of all, my question is, why is it hidden? It shouldn't be hidden anymore by this period. But the second part was, here's somebody who has definitely been educated by Abigail Adams, done the monograph, brought a major historical work on a woman of the Revolutionary and early Republic period, and then writes a book where women appear, but it's group actions, and it's about seamstresses. 3 times it's talking, well, does the reader understand how integral seamstresses were to having a war and a revolution, the work that they had to do? And why isn't that considered heroic work? Try, sewing up that many shirts that would exist through a war. Okay, so again, we have to ask ourselves, who, what, how, when does America make somebody influential? And do we keep that in mind as we write these big narratives as well as the smaller ones? Furthermore, we have to ask, who is researching and writing women's history? The hope is that it's not just that women's history is defined by women writing it, but indeed that we have men and others writing it as well. It is for everybody, not just one segment of our culture. So these were some of the questions I was thinking, and as I said, the biggest thing that gets to me as I look at textbooks and I look at general narratives is, how is the integration working? And obviously more work is to be done. And I ask that question because just how did they, putting they into quotation marks, how did they mount a revolution and fight a war without women? And the answer is, they didn't. Okay, start.
Thank you. 6 minutes. next, Lauren.
Well, thank you all for being here today. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is how we define war and where war happens, right? And I think this is really important when we're thinking about women in the revolution, right? It has real stakes for how we think about women's history and how women fit into these broader narratives of the revolution. And I think in a lot of ways, for scholars, for the general public, there's this sense that the war and the founding of the nation is the story, right? And this sets up this false dichotomy where everything else, including women's experiences, women's kind of the conversations on women's roles and the consequences, is almost somewhat secondary, right, to these main events unfolding at Independence Hall or Valley Forge or Yorktown. But of course, right, as women's and gender scholars have shown, including several people in this room and on this panel and Barbara's wonderful edited volume, this textbook narrative of the revolution really overlooks the extent to which the revolution was fundamentally this brutal civil war fought among civilian communities, right? Communities composed of various people of different genders and races and statuses, political loyalties, right? People for whom war occurred not on a distant battlefield, but in their homes and in their streets and their schoolhouses, on their farms. And during the revolution, there really wasn't any kind of clear division, right, between the home front and the battlefront, as there were in the 20th century American wars, right? In fact, in many instances during the revolution, the home front became the battlefront. During the war, the British Army occupied every major city on the eastern seaboard. Battles raged on the outskirts of these regions. Here in Philadelphia, inhabitants kind of recounted climbing up on their roofs to watch the battles occurring. And these urban battles and sieges, right, the movement of troops, the requisitioning of supplies, the attendant property destruction, theft, invasion, quartering, violence, sexual assault, right, all of this is war, right? And it encompasses such a broader group of people, right, than we typically associate with the military history of the revolution. And so I think what I've been thinking a lot about, right, is what happens if we reconceptualize how we think about war, right? We think about it as a societal experience, right, that upends daily life for all of these people who inhabit this world that is suddenly at war, right? That it's obviously different groups of people, women, men, enslaved people, right, have their different consequences for these different groups of people, different vulnerabilities, even opportunities, right? But this is a war waged by and endured by an entire society. And I think reframing the war this way as something fought by societies rather than just armies and generals really has the potential to fundamentally reshape how we think about women in the war, right, and women's place in narratives of the revolution, because it illustrates how deeply the revolution extended beyond the battlefield, right? How much of this violence and the waging of war really affects this much broader group of people, right, who are more relevant to the story. And it makes the revolution so much more nuanced, so much more human. And I think it exposes how, for various people, including women, right, the war really upends their lives, right? It alters them for better, for worse. It has lasting consequences. And in truth, we really can't talk about kind of a singular women's history of the revolution, right, but how many different women experienced it. How the war altered their lives and how those lives intersected and affected one another. So for instance, right, think about enslaved families, right? The proximity of a British army willing to offer emancipation and the kind of same devastation that brought so much havoc and disruption to Anglo-American families, for them is this moment of opportunity, right, to protect their loved ones, protect their kin, secure their freedom. And so I think this kind of different approach to thinking about war, right, really clarifies the different stakes that the revolution had for different women, white, Black, Indigenous, and literally the contradictory ways that they experienced war and its meaning for their lives, whether as participants or laborers, freedom seekers, victims, and how these actions and experiences not only shaped the war itself, but also reverberated beyond the military conflict, right, with real consequences for American society. And so I think crucially, this kind of a different approach to thinking about war and a broader conception of where war happens has the potential to move gender more fully to the traditional narratives of the revolution, right? Because it asks not whether the revolution was just good or bad for women, which is a very important and productive conversation, right? But one that kind of inadvertently positions it as outside that main narrative, right? But rather it asks how the war's penetration into these very intimate familial, domestic spaces, right, affects the relationships that structure all of colonial society, right, on this really broad scale. And so I think what I'm hoping we can talk through today is just thinking really how we might reframe war, right? How we might tell different stories and ways to help bring women's experiences more to the forefront, to build on some of Holly's comments.
Great. Everybody's meeting their times. I should say we're being very careful about timing up here so that everybody gets a chance to ask questions and make comments. So next, Serena.
Is this is on? You all can hear me. Great, thank you. My comments are indeed somewhat less formal, even than Lauren's and Holly's, and I want to start also just by saying how honored I am to be up here to celebrate Barbara, whom of course I've known for a long time, but really got to know as a contributor to that volume, which was incredibly important for me to be able to present some of my work on families, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment, and to be up here with these people. And I think I just want to claim that I'm Mary Beth's niece, maybe, or stepdaughter or something like that. We're gonna continue this family piece because I want to pick up on Lauren's final piece about the ways in which war penetrates into families. Because when I was in college, I had a class on families in early America, and I read a lot of family. I was assigned a lot of family histories. Those New England family histories from the 70s. And even then, I was like, it's a father-son story, right? When we think about the stories that people were writing in the 70s. And even then, I was like, wow, how did they reproduce? I could never figure that out, right? With the naivete of an 18-year-old. I just don't understand what's happening here. And so so I've really been intrigued by these ways in which we define the idea of family, right? So sometimes families are these all-male spaces in which what we're really talking about is the orderly devolution of property from fathers to sons, right? And that seems to be sometimes the definition of family. And then sometimes we talk about it as this domestic, apolitical, and slightly useless space, right? And that's populated solely by women and other irrational beings like children, right? And so I've really been curious about how do these two pieces fit together? And so picking up on Lauren's piece about the ways in which war penetrates into families and really on Mary Beth's much, earlier and important work about thinking about, what are men doing when we talk about gender, right? That I wanted in my work and to continue to think a little bit with you all today about what does it look like to start thinking about families as actually important places and important actors in the revolution, right? So that we are going to get rid of this single guy, heroic person, writing by himself, right? That we actually need to think not just that armies need support staff, which of course they do. We all know the ways in which, when there's no one in a army to do laundry, that produces enormous problems as well as lice, right? Laundry, it becomes essential, and yet is tedious. I don't believe any of us here will deny that. But to say that, just to look at support, while essential for understanding how the war was fought, is maybe also not quite sufficient. That we really, I think about families as building blocks for the 18th century, right? It's a building block for both political and social worlds. And those two pieces come together, right? It's not that men actually are not part of families. They are. And they want them, right? We've been spending some time thinking about the ways in which men want families both for their own status, right? We know a lot about the ways in which being the head of a household is an essential position. We know that this is true, for enslaved men, right? For African-descended free men also, as well as white men, are claiming that what it means to live in the 18th century century world as a full man is to be part of a family. So we know that they claim this in part as patriarchy, but we also know that, men in the 18th century were also capable of love and affection, and that they truly also want to be connected to people in the same ways that we know that women also are parts of families for many social reasons, many economic reasons, but also because they're full human beings who want connections with others. So as we think about the nature of the revolution as a world of connections that are being made and being split apart, one of the things that we see is that language of family that constructs, as I've written elsewhere, really constructs the ways in which colonists and political people, right, people just wearing their politics hats, understand family as a really useful and powerful metaphor. We understand also that through the revolution, these ideas about how a family works that are both affectionate, right, and also maybe we'd say utilitarian, right? That both of those things continue and are strengthened through the revolution, right? Revolution does not dismantle ideas about family. It might have done that, right? There are lots of opportunities for families that are split apart not to remake themselves. And sometimes, of course, people choose these as opportunities for self-divorce, right? That's one of the things that the Army does. Sometimes it is an opportunity for people to decide that they are going to remake, a different kind of family structure. But overwhelmingly, this is not a chance where people decide to say, oh, let's think about, bigger, what do I want to say? Multi-spouse families, right? That's not, that could have happened in the revolution, right? People could have thought, well, let's upend this vision of a family, but they don't. They dig into it. And so I think that looking at this recommitment to the idea of family might help us understand better what the revolution does as it reconstructs the relationships between men and women.
By 4 seconds. Excellent. Okay, so when we talked about this session among ourselves on email, we said that we would have a brief exchange among all of us after everybody made their initial presentations, and then we were going to open it up to the audience for comments and questions. And this is great because we've got more than half an hour now, but I want to take up a little bit of time for an exchange among the participants on the panel. And go back to, sorry, I've got this. I'm sorry. Go back to Holly's initial comment about how integral is the history of women to general narratives of the revolution, and to underscore her point, which I thought was very well taken, that even Woody Holton, who wrote a prize-winning book about Abigail Adams, then proceeded to write a book about the American Revolution, which does mention women, but not very often. And this is a common shtick I've had in recent years, that the history of women has not been fully integrated into the narrative of sort of what you might say standard American history or standard historical commentary. I think there's still a lot of people who feel as though they can write the history of the revolution without talking about women, or with talking about women only very briefly, and not just in textbooks, but also elsewhere. However, I do want to make one positive comment, not about integration of women's history, but I don't know how many people know that John Wood Sweet's book, The Sewing Girl's Tale, has just won enormous numbers of prizes, and it's a wonderful book, and it is a man writing about a woman, in this case, a woman who was raped and who brought the very first case against her rapist in New York City history. So I can recommend that book, but it is by a man, so that's very good. A man writing women's history, that's a good start. But I'm reminded of years ago when I helped to set up the women's studies program at Cornell, at the debate in the faculty we all said confidently, once people understand about the background of women, it will be fully integrated into scholarship. Everybody will know that. It has not happened, as we all know. And so I would like the Holly she laid out the question. I'd like to know her answer to it. And then the other panelists also, this question about, yes, it's true, everybody's doing all this interesting stuff, but how do we break into standard narratives? So I'll turn it over to the others. See if anybody can come up with a good answer.
We're still trying to find the answer. At least we do have that mission, which is wonderful. We are still in pursuit of that. It isn't ended. And sorry, Woody, that you're always getting the words here today. And I appreciate it. So one way of integrating it, and I did appreciate this, is at times quoting women's observations about what was occurring in the revolution. Certainly there are many observations by men, but why not more of those? Now, granted, it's very difficult to find those quotations of women taking those political stands and putting it out in a form that we can find. But that is a plus that he did incorporate. I think the reason I got him on the seamstresses for this point is that this was being addressed in there, and it's right. It's sensible. This is factual. It's there. We've got this, and it is critical to put it. But my thought was, who's reading these, and would they pick up on how critical and how important the work of those seamstresses were? And one of the reasons it was in my mind was that there was a Washington Post editorial by a high school senior who was complaining about that women are not in her textbooks anymore. Now, granted, I have a question about that, having taught in classes where I've taught stuff about this, and then I have some, well, we didn't cover that. Yes, we did on that particular date. It is this particular reading. But I thought maybe what it is, what we write is not attracting. That what is sensible, what makes sense, what is factual, what is put in there is not appealing to their sensibility. And so my thought was sometimes we have to think both sense and sensibility in terms of what we write and what the reader is expecting and what they will remember and what kind of women they will remember and the actions that we take. So I'm seeing some evidence of this, both sense and sensibility, but not enough. And part of it may be a little too much focus on the sense and the facts and not enough on the sensibility of the readers and of our public and what they want from all of this. And so that would be the charge for all of us who are writing, is to keep that part in mind. Are we doing something that they can remember that is truly memorable in this and take with them as a model? I sometimes think that our readers, especially our younger ones, are looking in some way for a model. They're looking for heroes, not social media heroes. And if we can provide that part as well as the group dynamics and the group interpretations, we might have something there. So that's one way. I think we're still at work on it and we're doing it, but we've got the challenges there for us to continue and to do better.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this a bit yesterday, right? And just how important it is to have those names, right, or individuals, to interweave them into the story, right, to kind of give a woman that people can latch onto, right? That it's not just a group, which sometimes is all you have, right? But really doing the work to try to identify those people. One of the things I was thinking about, and this kind of is going after Serena's comments, is thinking more about the networks that kind of sustain revolutionary society, right? Because I think if we view it that way, right, the ways in which men and women are connected to one another, their relationships are embedded and relational with one another, right, it gives us a new lens to really think about how we tell this story, right, and what matters to people, as opposed to what we think mattered at the time. And as Mary Beth's question really brought up at OAH, we had this great panel about kind of like, why don't we have histories of women at the center of, there's more about the early republic, right? But one of the things we were thinking about a lot is kind of the way that Republican motherhood functions in our narratives, right? And that it kind of becomes almost the stand-in, right? As a way to acknowledge women's experiences, acknowledge the shortcomings of the war and the revolutionary experiment, but then to kind of like circle back, right? And say, well, but eventually we got to the suffrage movement, right? And so I think it's filling in that gap in between, right? Like what happened in the war? What were women doing between making homespun, right, and the tea boycotts, and then Republican mothers, right? Like what is that connective thread?
Let's see. So I'll pick up on a couple of things. One is to think about. I mean, I'm all for thinking about Jane Austen, and Sense and Sensibility is great. No, but that brings us perhaps to Persuasion. Or I was thinking about Mansfield Park, actually, if we're going to think about, some maybe the Navy is what's sort of under theorized for us. But I do think that that there's something, and I write about this a tiny bit, that there's something about the way in which Austen does privilege a perspective on a moment of war, right, that comes out of a woman's domestic experience that is absolutely, that only makes sense. Those are stories that only make sense because Britain is at war, right? And, maybe we do have a little something that we can learn from Austen and the ways in which we restructure our thinking. So I'll put a plug out there for Sense and Sensibility. But as we think about what is the sensibility more seriously, I wonder about this question of heroism, right? And again, is it that people are looking for these individual heroes, right? Are kind of, guys that are just standing there by themselves, and that's what we're trying to replace with individual female heroines? Or, is there, and, this is the experience I have, at least with my students, is there's a fascination, I think, with the idea of what collective action can do. What does it mean to work together, right? What is the power of people coming together, which is sometimes a terrifying power, I think, or at least my students see that, but sometimes effective. And I wonder if maybe one of the things that we need to do is restructure some of the ways in which we talk about, what is heroic, if we thought about that as more collective actions, right, and celebrated those also, that might be a way in which we could think about how people work together. And that includes women who are situated in all of these different places that don't necessarily seem to have the spotlight on them at any given moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks a lot for everybody. I'm going to go on with one other comment our topic that the four of us discussed, and then I'm going to open it up. And the other topic that I want to raise briefly is the issue of the sources and archives that we have for women's history, because I can tell you when I first started to work on Liberty's Daughters, people said to me, I couldn't write that book because nothing survived to allow me to do it. I found 450 sets of family papers that I used, but I was told there was nothing there. And some of you here read a talk I gave last night at the Museum of the American Revolution, where my chief information drew from not a source that we didn't know, but a source that I now have a better tool of approaching, and that is American newspapers digitized so I could do keyword searches. And so that's a source we've long known, but historians now have tools that we didn't once have. And I only dealt with the 1760s and early 1770s, but I wonder if people did keyword searches on American newspapers during the Revolution, whether that would also give completely new information. But everybody on this panel has been very creative in the use of archives and sources that people said there's no women in those. So I wanted to have comments from each of them about what they found and how they found it. So,
which is marvelous, which is go in there and dig deep and understand you're looking for little nuggets and you're looking for one little comment on it. So when I did Belonging to the Army on the Camp Followers, what was I getting into is things like orderly books. So a very military history source working through the orders and other observations about the Army, the regiments, the companies, to find a phrase that is discussing the women that belong to the Army in some form or another. And so that is one way of saying they're there. They're not always recognized, but at times they're acknowledged for what they are supposed to be doing or not doing, or some other part of that. So it was, go into those regular traditional sources that are usually one way and go against the grain and look for something else in that particular source. The others are the pension accounts, and I will say, thank heavens to the David Library, which is now the sources are here in the David Center, is I went through microfilm roll, which is indeed something to be remembered in my career, is how can you go fast and know how to pick up something really quickly without getting seasick? And now it's available on Fold 3, and I'm very, very thankful for that, is all these sources that are online there. But that is one way, is again going against the grain and saying that may not be regular, but maybe you need to look at sources you wouldn't think about, because they'll show that, yes, if we look at this revolution, if we look at this war in the context, they're always there, but not always recognized.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would echo everything Holly just said. So my work is more with the British Army as opposed to the Continental Army. So I've dug pretty deeply into the British headquarters papers, and again, it's looking at sources you wouldn't expect. Like, women are all over these papers, right? They are writing letters and petitions to commanding officers. They are in lists, registers of enslaved people behind British lines, right? They're in quartermaster's records. One of my favorite sources that I found in the course of this was actually courts-martial, right? Because you have all of these instances where there are civilians, right, of all races, some of them literate, some not, right, who come and kind of are testifying about what British officers and soldiers are doing to their communities. And it just is this amazing treasure trove, right? There was almost so much I couldn't fit it all in, right? But it's places that I think often the women in the military records are ignored by military historians. And I'm not sure women's and gender historians until very recently have started probing those records. And there's just so much there. As Serena, I'm sure, can also talk about.
So I'll say I was, of course, inspired, especially by Holly's work, as as I went in and looked at, muster rolls and all those various bits of accounts, scraps of receipts that were especially in the British military papers. I think maybe I'll just say, this will give everyone a chance to think about your questions, because this is a comment that probably, looking at you all, probably 3/4 of you have heard me make before. But really, the other piece that I think really helps drive our new research is paying attention to the questions other scholars are asking and our own ignorance. So, for me, my Boston Massacre book really came from rereading that short narrative, right, of the horrid massacre that is, bits of which are reprinted in many high school readers, which, exist all over the place. And reading one of those first depositions and seeing that mention of a soldier's wife, and really saying to myself, after I read it and taught it many years, saying, who is this woman? What is she doing in this house? Like, soldiers are traveling to Boston with wives? Like, truly, it took that moment of thinking, like, I don't understand this. And it took those many years of previous scholarship that says, actually, there are women everywhere, right? As long as we open our eyes to where they might be. So sometimes it's not that the sources are so obscure. It's just that we have to actually remember the work that we all are writing for each other.
Thanks, everybody. And so I do have a couple of other topics on my list, but I want to open it up to the audience for comments and questions. And I assume there's a microphone. Yes, there's a microphone that will be moved around. So anybody? Over there, Adriana. Yeah.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this panel and for getting us going. I was really struck by your comments, Serena, about family, and listening to all four of you. I was thinking about how the American Revolution in some ways is three intersecting conflicts. There's a conflict that happened mainly east of the Appalachian Mountains about political control between Anglo-Americans and British authorities. There's a triangular war, as Sylvia Frey called it, in the South, and then there's a war of conquest that's ongoing past 1783, but really amplified by this moment. And this is happening west and north, mainly, of sort of where that urban core is and agricultural core of the colonies. And I was thinking about how a focus on gender and family helps us think about all three of those conflicts. And I feel like so far you've mainly, and your scholarship mainly focuses on that first conflict, but I'd love to hear you think more about directions for thinking about gender, family, and so on in these other spaces, the Southern conflict, the triangular conflict amongst patriots, British, and enslaved people, and then the war of conquest in the West, and how that affects. It's one form of family making war on a very different form of family, and so how you might think about that.
And actually, this raises another question that is bringing out the Western story is that I had actually on my list, which is talking about indigenous people and the involvement of we can say, indigenous families in the conflict. This very complicated conflict on the, well, whether we want to call it the backcountry or the frontier. So thanks for bringing that up, and I'll turn that over to other people.
Just to pick up on it, we were talking about this a bit last night. Actually, we were thinking we should have all gone out for tapas and sangria right now this morning, and we would have had this, another good conversation going with this. One of the things that I was thinking about, I guess it was the sangria, is we tend to talk about Native American and we talk about Native American warfare and an acknowledgement that if warriors wanted to war, they usually had to get permission of the women within their community because it was the women who gave them the supplies, who made sure that they were able to go to war. And I was going, well, in some ways, this is what we are talking about in the Anglo-American and other communities is who's giving you the supplies, who's giving you the context in which you can go to war, who is staying at home and doing things so that you can go to war, or you can do politics, or, sew the shirts. So I think that would be one way that if we are looking further to the Western theaters and other theaters is this issue about women within these families, how are they serving or supporting this going to war? And one of the ways on the frontier would be these are family enclaves. We have families that are moving into these frontier situations that are there in the backcountry with the Native Americans. What did the women and what do the families want to preserve their homesteads or to preserve their homes? So I think you're very right that family and women have a major thing to say about that triangular war. In fact, we could add women in it, and is that a quadrangular war? I don't know, is that if we add that other approach to it. So that's a very off-the-top question. I'm sure Serena can do better with that.
I don't know why I could do better, but yes. So thanks, Jess. I have a couple of thoughts. It seems so mean to keep referring to last night, but we started Barbara's conference without her. Sorry, and we just we went out to start thinking about this, and the conversations just kind of kept rolling. And one of the things that I kind of think it was Holly who said it that's really shifted, I think, for historians of women in the Revolution has been the contributions of historians of slavery and particularly of enslaved women for the 19th century, right? So there's been an explosion, of course, of work on white women slaveholders in the 19th century, and one of the topics that I think we're just beginning to scratch is this question of what does that mean for the 18th century in a moment when this language of, liberty and possibility is so live, and for so many white women that that language of liberty is precisely predicated on the expansion of enslavement. So I think that piece is there, and it's one of those bits that we need to look to some of the scholarship that's already out there to help guide our questions.
Kind of thinking about Indigenous women, I do also want to just call out Maeve Kane's work on the Haudenosaunee, because I think it does such a fabulous job, right, of showing what happens when the revolution comes into Indigenous communities, right, and particularly what that means for women. And I think there's so much more to be done in that vein for many different nations, right, not just the Haudenosaunee. I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is kind of the way in which, Jess, you talked about kind of the expansion into the conquest, right? And how that's actually tied to the vision of family and household that comes out of the war. It's something that for so much of the conflict, people are looking forward to, right? They're fantasizing about being back home with everyone around the fireplace, right? And then at the end of the war, there's this sense of like, they fought to secure this independence, right? And independence, as Serena says, it's their own household, right? It's kind of being at home with their family, perhaps enslaving others. And so much of that gets bound up in kind of the way that the nation moves west, right? Like allowing every veteran, even in things like land bounties, right, to have their own vine and fig trees, right? That is the fruits of independence. And so I think it's kind of a longer trajectory, right? Kind of thinking about how the ideas of family and war and this disruption really ties into kind of what people are looking for and the expectations they have of the new government as well.
Yeah, how it affects different regions differently, too, I would say. Okay, other comments and questions from the audience? I hope there are more. That was a great one to start off with. If not, I'll have to bring things up. There's another one. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I want to encourage more, and I want to hear your thoughts about more collaboration between art historians, military historians, expanding source materials, looking at material culture,
Right.
and I want to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah,
Yeah, that's excellent. All right, comments.
I think it's so important, right? Because I think, obviously, as we were talking about, like women are in more of these sources than maybe we think, but we also still have to cast a broad net, right? And so much of it there's so much out there also in the material culture, right? In artwork and novels, right? Particularly if we're thinking about kind of ways that people are remembering the war, right? Or kind of thinking about what women did during the war. And so I think in the early republic, there is this real kind of reckoning, right? With what did the war mean? And looking at those kind of cultural sources can really help us get a sense of like, how did people think about women's contributions, right? Like, what is the narrative of the war that was being written almost as soon as it was over? And I think just, the more we can kind of bring in broader sources, the more stories it lets us tell, the more women in their lives that we can kind of touch on and integrate into the bigger story of the revolution.
Another possibility is to look beyond our time into it and to be a little more aware of what other histories are doing later. And what has been really striking to me is how much more we're seeing, of course, in 20th century histories, which makes sense. Women do start serving in the military. They are finally incorporated into the military. And so with 20th century military history, there is a bit more incorporation with that, and so we're behind. We don't quite see it. We don't have the records and everything that they're doing, but I'm thinking in particular, what struck me is a retired Army Major General by the name of Mary Eder had referred to the frustrations about absent women, and she contended that our understanding of war is incomplete because of how women's roles in the military and war are omitted or distorted. And she was talking very much 20th century in this. And one of the points to make is, are you talking about women in war, or are you talking about women in the military? These are two different aspects that we can do. If we talk about war, we can go very broad, and we should be. That is the context in which war is being made, is with the women are definitely part of it. It gets a bit tougher on the military side. But again, if we are talking about later history, the military and military historians are starting to confront this. The base renaming has been a major part of this. Now, granted, that was more about Confederacy and honoring the Confederacy. But just to bring out a few names where we are starting to get names and more recognition, is that if we look at it, we can see some of these names, and I just wanted to present a few. I was thinking about it as I came back. Fort A.P. Hill is now Fort Walker in honor of Dr. Mary Edwards, who was a surgeon during the Civil War, and it was awarded a Medal of Honor. So here we are finding names. Can we find names like that for the Revolution? Fort Lee is now Fort Gregg Adams for Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg and Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams, who was the WAC in charge of the 888th. Both black leaders but we have a woman that is being recognized for the service. Fort Benning is now Fort Moore for Lieutenant General Hal Moore and his wife Julia Moore, which really perked up because here we're talking camp follower. Okay, we've got somebody here who's being recognized, but her inclusion for leadership of military family programs in the Vietnam, and how indeed widows were to be notified of their husband's death. A major issue here. So if the Army can do this, military historians can do this for the 20th century, what can we do for the 18th century? And incorporating these kind of understandings and recognition of women then. So that would be a little material culture, but how do we name buildings and recognize actions that way?
Let me make a brief comment about material culture. I haven't done much with it myself, but in my scholarship on the Revolution and women, I've been struck by how often teapots are mentioned and by how often there is a discussion of what exactly people drink tea out of. I remember vividly finding a letter from a woman to her sister saying, I was staying overnight at this tavern, and they didn't serve tea out of a proper teapot. They boiled it in a pot on the stove and just poured it into cups, and isn't that disgusting? And also Peter Oliver, the very dyspeptic historian, loyalist historian of the American Rebellion, as he called it, complained or declared that patriot women were deliberately drinking tea out of chocolate or coffee pots to hide the fact that they were in fact drinking tea and pretending that they were drinking coffee or chocolate. And indeed, I did find one woman, when I did Liberty's Daughters, I did find one woman who said that she and her family did drink tea out of a coffee pot. So there's a little bit of material culture anyway, teapots and their significance, their symbolic importance in resistance to the revolution. Okay, other questions, comments? Yes, Bob.
Yeah, everything, oh, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Oh, Kathy, okay, yes.
yeah.
I saw Bob getting I didn't see you getting a microphone. But okay, go ahead, Kathy.
Like all bad academics, I have a comment and then a question. And the comment is this: while I don't dispute the veracity of the things that our panelists said, that we are still in 2023 reminding people that women are indeed and do in fact populate archival sources is both infuriating and soul-crushing in equal measure. And now a question. And the question is this, and it speaks to the point that Holly, but also several of you touched on with regards to how these histories, which are out there and are being written, are integrated into master narratives. And it does seem to me that Mary Beth is exactly right, that if we just wait and expect that somehow things will change, we will be disappointed, always, always. And so I wonder if we look toward the 250th as an opportunity to inject women and gender and families into larger stories, big stories about the revolution that reach broad audiences, what you see happening, what you think needs to happen, and so on. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone?
Yes, I certainly was thinking about the 250 as I was thinking about, what are these definitions of heroism that we maybe want to help larger organizations with, a bigger audience than we have think about, what are the stories that we want to tell? And of course, the story that we all are struggling with, right, is this question about how dark or how bright a story do we want to tell at the celebration of the founding, right? And so as we get at that question, the place of where women fit into it, needs to be also central, which is why we think about, what does it mean that there are women whose own liberty is predicated on slaveholding, right? What do we mean when we say that there are women whose own liberty is predicated on the disruption created by the British Army? All of those pieces. But I would push personally this question of power in community. I think that is that's a way that we can connect the past and the present, in which we don't understand. I think our easy understanding of community is actually rarely single sex, and that may be a kind of easier place to bring all these pieces in.
Anybody else?
My big question is, and I know all of these are going on, everybody's going to celebrate this 250th, and we're coming up with exhibitions, is how many times do the planners, when they start putting this all together, go, okay, this is the general narrative, and we're going to have the Stamp Act, and then we're going to move to the massacre, and then we're going to move to this, and oh, by the way, where do women fit? Right. Where's going to be the vignette on talking about women? Mm-hmm. Where's going to be the vignette about Black revolutionaries versus Black loyalists? Mm-hmm. So we're still getting the general narrative, but where do we add in? As opposed to saying, can you say each one of those vignettes, can you tell each one of those stories with the women already in them? Mm-hmm. As opposed to them. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges, and I'm not sure if it's all going to be done, but that's where I see it. And you're right, we got to keep fighting it. We have an undertow that says we come back to that general narrative. How do we change the narrative?
Yeah, good. Lauren, you want to make a comment? No, go ahead. No.
Yeah, and I think it's very much about starting that narrative somewhere else, right? Somewhere that recognizes the interdependence of this world, right? And just kind of says, what does the revolution look like if we start kind of not where we think it starts, right? If we try to narrate it in ways that bring in all of these different people and can provide different vantage points, right? Not just say that there's one story, but there's lots of different ways that people experience the war, right? Lots of different meanings that the revolution had for different people, and that they're all related, right? This is such an interdependent world that if we can kind of not just pull out the individuals, but show how those individuals are connected to everyone else and what's happening in the war, I think it gives us a really good starting point to start having more nuanced conversations about what's actually going on in this period.
Okay, thanks. And I want to give Bob a chance here. We're almost out of time. But
Yeah,
go ahead,
thank
Bob.
you. Despite the Mary Beth's reference to pouring tea from coffee pots, but actually all of the kinds of evidence that you've discussed this morning is documentary. Mm-hmm. And that reminded me of John McNeill's fabulous address about peak document to the American Historical Association. And of course, we have the example of Annette Gordon Reed's genetic work, right, with respect to the Hemmings family. And so I wonder whether non-documentary evidence has played any role in your work to highlight the role of women in the revolution and in society at that time, and whether there are ways in which you foresee that as a possibility. Thanks.
I'll just respond briefly and say there are people who are doing that sort of thing. I am not. And I don't have a lot of background in material culture, to put it mildly. But I do think there are some very interesting things that have been done. What is...
Yours went out.
It went out? Okay. Right. There were some very interesting things that have been done, and I may have turned that off by mistake, fiddling with it. But I haven't done it. I have read interesting work on the topic, and I think you're right, Bob, that all of us on the panel today really have dealt with documentary sources of one sort or another, and it's useful, as you and the previous questioner also raised, to think about other ways of doing it, other ways of looking at sources. I know that art historians are using representations, that is, pictorial representations of women and men in interesting ways, and reading those paintings and those engravings and so forth in ways that can be very helpful. It's not something I personally have done, and I don't know whether anybody else on the panel has personally done it. Here, let me pass this back.
The only thing I've seen is usually the archaeology at some of the forts, the garrisons, and they are looking for items that would have been on women's clothing, not on men's clothing, as evidence that they are there. The one I did, it wasn't on the Revolution, it was an article really on Fort Ligonier and women with the Forbes expedition, and Fort Ligonier had dug up a number of soles of shoes that were women's shoes. So you don't have the cloth top because the cloth has, of course, deteriorated over time, but the leather shoe sole was still there. And here is your evidence that women were there by the soles of their shoes. So that's, again, giving us the evidence. It may not be talked always with the record, but there you've got the physical evidence.
My own work, a lot of the kind of ways I get beyond the documentary record has been with like artwork or really thinking about memory of the war. But one of the things that I've worked with quite a bit is actually they're the Seasons medals. So they're peace medals that are created during Washington's administration. My own work is about the household, right? And it's really fascinating because it depicts a sewer, a herder, and then a woman spinning, right? Kind of just the way that the iconography of domesticity gets kind of woven in to the symbols of the nation, right? And kind of really thinking about what the war meant for people. And I think even in my work, I don't deal as much with like physical sources, but I'm very interested in kind of uncovering the material world that people inhabited, right? So actually in the documentary record, looking for, what did houses and streets look like, right? What are these places that people inhabited to really bring these worlds to life? And then hopefully other historians with training and those other types of methodologies can bring more light to the questions you've asked.
Serena, you have anything to add?
Really briefly, maybe just adding on to Lauren's piece, that I've been, long interested in the kind of kinetic or the relationship of a body to space, right? So in my first book, I talked a bunch about dancing and dancing masters because I love that idea. But how is it that the ways in which people's bodies are connected to each other also can help us understand, other things about how they understood the world, how they lived in the world. So how people's bodies are on ships together, right? Are on streets together, and are sitting around drinking together. All of those pieces, I think, are worth looking at. But of course, they are relatively evanescent. So much of the evidence for that, I think, does largely sit in the documentary record. We just have to think about what is it that they're describing.
This one is not working. So thanks, everybody. This is great, and we've ended on time. Organizers, I'm just pointing that out.